Welcome to the chaos sector. At this point of our investigation, we must explain to our audience that you have to expect the unexpected. The unexpected is what you never get told by the media or authorities. You have to question what you see, hear, or even what is presented as factual. I have a question for you. The security camera from the neighbors heard a dog bark, an individual whimpering, and a loud thumping noise, right? But this camera didn't pick up any screaming in the home? How many people believe that there were screams heard in the home? I'll wait. Okay, that's about 98%. Now, here's another question. How many of you believe that this screaming would be heard by that neighbor's security camera? 100%, that's good. How many people would believe that if that security camera heard screaming, then obviously roommates who either weren't murdered, or hadn't been murdered yet, would also hear that screaming? That's good, we're getting somewhere. You got an A+ on the assignment. But wait, the professor says you failed? How is this possible? You got the answer right. There was no report, no account, no audio heard from the security camera regarding screams. Hold on, there must be something wrong with the assignment. Calm down, we will figure this out. Give me a second. Let's assume that the suspect murdered individuals on the third floor first. If he did, then Mortensen accounts of Gonsalves stating, "There's someone here," means she is awake. Okay, she's awake, that's the key point right now. She is then stabbed. Does she scream? Or is the stabbing so violent, as suggested by many, she couldn't even scream out in pain? Not likely. So, she screams, the dog barks, right? Mogan, who is assumed to be asleep, wakes up, and she also screams, and even more when she is being stabbed. The security camera across the street has to pick this up, right? Since Kernodle was already awake, when she is stabbed, does she scream? She screams. This scream is not heard outside the home, but a whimpering noise was. Yeah, that is making a lot of sense. Kernodle is screaming, it wakes up Ethan, and there is a struggle. There are 2 points here: the security camera which heard the dog barking, someone quote, whimpering, which is a very faint sound based on the distance from the home, and a loud thumping noise, somehow didn't hear any of this screaming in the home. And of course, Mortensen, and even Funk at this point, never heard screaming. Remember, this is where we started our investigation at, this physical activity within the home. Now this is something we wanted to examine, but kinda got swept away with our viewers. Let me tell you something, for a residence to have a security camera, indicates they want to keep track of everything, or everyone, who approaches that property. Surveillance footage from that camera is checked on a daily basis. Let's look at 2 different versions of a photo taken of that home. As you see, one has the individuals blurred out, while the other doesn't. So who decided to unblur the individuals' faces, if they were blurred initially? Or, were they initially unblurred, and then they quickly blurred the faces? I'm guessing it's the latter. And the reason for blurring those faces, especially the female to the right, is because she appears to know something. She has knowledge of something, it's all in her facial expressions, her demeanor is very unnerving. She is looking down, and if you have studied body language and eye behavior, when someone looks down, it's usually a sign of guilt. Comparing her behavior to the other residents, they are making eye contact, with their postures up. They appear comfortable engaging with the authorities. But their roommate appears to distance herself from engaging with the authorities. Not to say she is guilty of any real crime, but the guilt of withholding information about what happened that night. She almost appears afraid to even be in the presence of the authorities, right? It's clear to see. We investigate, but we also investigate the investigations. If we examine this layout of that area, you can see how close, and how far, the neighbor's home is. I say how close, and how far, to distinguish the ability to detect screaming greater than detecting whimpering sounds. Whimpering sounds, or not screams, or yells. Whimpering is a low-pitched sound, noise, that in fact can be detected. But in comparison to hearing screams during a massacre, clearly those high-pitched screams would have been detected. If you agree that individuals who were awake and suffered stab wounds were screaming, then they are withholding evidence of screams being heard. Why? Because it contradicts the chain of events in the home, which literally alarms everyone who was not harmed. Also, if screams are heard from that security camera, and it's early in the morning, surely neighbors would be awakened. Those homes are in close proximity of each other, so whoever was awake would have heard screaming. Early birds got that worm for sure. And it wouldn't be mistaken for party noises. The authorities are called, the killer either flees before the authorities get there, or he is struck down by the authorities. A double-edged sword presents itself here. Either there was screaming, which essentially retraces every step of the investigation, or there weren't screams, which creates a new development into the investigation. Let's connect some dots. May I suggest to you that there wasn't any screaming? How is this possible? Because, by the time they were so-called stabbed to death, they were not in the condition to do much screaming, rather, whimperings, or cries. What am I getting at here? It's not because they were asleep and awakened by being stabbed, although many would suggest this. Rather, they were drugged. Yep, they were drugged, and then, they were stabbed to death. A suspect entering a home doesn't know what he's in for unless he has scoped the scene, right? Well, this suspect scoped the scene and noticed several cars parked in the driveway, and a dog. Despite it being at night, obviously there are more individuals than he could challenge by himself by head count. Individuals were up, lights were on. So even if some were asleep, he's still taking a risk in entering the home, because he doesn't know the physical location of who is awake. Just because a bedroom's light is off, doesn't mean they are asleep. In fact, they may not even be in their bedroom. Such as Gonzalez and Mogan, they were in the same bedroom. For the suspect to enter the home, in my opinion, would have to be under the influence of some type of drug, or knows exactly the setting inside. Because there is a great chance that he will be either attacked, killed himself, or eventually arrested. Look into the mind for a moment. The suspect arrives, spots lights on, and decides to enter the home, knowing that individuals are awake. Keep in mind, he doesn't have a firearm, which he could just run through the house and shoot everyone. He only has a knife, and despite how deadly a knife can be, its effectiveness is severely reduced in such a setting. Point here? Perhaps he stabs one person to death, but there is no way he stabs 4 people to death. What I'm doing is giving a pretext to what was reported in the toxicology results. Why don't we go ahead and do that now? Kathy Mabbitt stated, quote, "The toxicology reports aren't relevant to the case. They can be related to the cause, or manner of death, but they aren't in this case," unquote. Not releasing the toxicology report? Do you think because the victims were stabbed to death, this information is not vital? Perhaps alcohol or drugs in their systems could lead to a suspect. By law, she is within her rights to not perform a toxicology report. Like she mentioned, if the toxicology examination is not the cause of death, nor does not influence the cause of death, then there is no requirement to perform it. But the problem with this, especially with a homicide, it can benefit an investigation on who could have murdered the victims. It's voluntary, because there is no law that prohibits the medical examiner from performing one, even though it's not required in such a homicide. And that's the problem, her decision not to do it. She could be of great service if she discovers alcohol or drugs in connection to who those victims were associated with earlier the night of. This report will be given to the authorities, and could lead to a potential suspect. Maybe an individual got them extremely intoxicated, so they could later murder them? That alcohol, and the level of alcohol, could provide key information to the authorities. And, even a motive. Perhaps they were partying with a group of friends, and there was someone spotted in a grub truck surveillance camera, appearing very suspicious, who may have drugged them. And then later that night, they were easily stabbed to death, to why there was no screams heard from the, "Damn it, I spoiled one of my theories. I couldn't help it." Well, let's get it out the way then. Some may have been asleep, but let's break down the time frame. GHB, Rohypnol, ketamine, whichever one you want to choose. Let's focus on Rohypnol. It resembles an aspirin, and when dropped in a drink, usually an alcoholic beverage, it is colorless and odorless. The drug usually takes full effect on the victim within 30 minutes to 1 hour of ingestion. If a high dosage is given, the blackout time can extend to 24 hours. Victims may be aware of being undressed and assaulted, but are incapable of reacting or resisting. Because this drug is colorless and odorless, and resembles an aspirin, it can be given to someone even after drinking, and still have an effect on them. The reason I present this as a possibility, and a high one at that, is because it's virtually impossible for one individual, regardless of how aggressive, stealthful, and calculated, to physically stab 4 people to death. Unless, there had to be an inhibitor to allow this. Many can suggest that they were asleep, but not all of them were asleep. Based on accounts, Gonzalez and Kernodle were awake. Once again, these are 2 of the victims. So if they didn't scream when being stabbed to death, what do you make of that physical activity? A very odd chain of events. But, if they had been drugged, their entire system is disoriented, meaning, they may feel themselves being stabbed, but are so disoriented, the shock reaction of being stabbed isn't there, such as a sober person's reaction. The pain doesn't reach the brain until perhaps they have been stabbed multiple times. As a result, their quote, expression of pain, is merely a whimper, or moan-like cry, not a scream, such as a sober person who reacts out of physical shock. Are we on the same page here? The fact that the medical examiner didn't release the toxicology report, once again, generates suspicions. She is not a detective, so she can't determine if something is relevant to a murder or not. Give your examination of what was discovered, plain and simple. Come to think about it, this is actually malpractice, or even worse, abusing her power as a medical examiner, by either not performing one, or performing it and concealing it from the public. I believe she stated there was a toxicology report done, at some point. But to this point, it hasn't been released to the news media. This could be used to find out what unfolded prior to their murders, something detectives would work hard to find. Another mysterious aspect, and when there's a mystery, there's secrecy, and when there's secrecy, there is a conspiracy. Claiming that the toxicology report is irrelevant is suggesting that a suspect wasn't involved in any form of tampering with an alcoholic beverage, just because the victims were stabbed to death. Or placing a drug in their food at the grub truck they were previously, just because the victims were stabbed to death. There is nothing wrong with reporting that they had alcohol in their system, it does not place them in a negative light. Or even common drugs such as marijuana. That's irrelevant to their deaths. But what is relevant is the potential for a quote, foreign substance, being used against them, which may have contributed to their physical state before their deaths. Could it be that they found drugs to induce sedation, physically impairing an individual? If this was present in their system, then there obviously was more than one person that night. This was a group effort. Someone drugged them, then someone stabbed them to death. Knowing where they were when they got home, where they were located in the home. Now going back, screams were not heard, because the victims were physically impaired by drugging, and they were not capable of screaming. Rather, whimpers, or cries, such as Mortenson's accounts. She didn't hear screams, she heard cries. Such as someone physically sedated to the point they are too weak to scream or yell, so the only strength they can muster up is a whimper or cry. Those terms are basically the same here, keep that in mind. And in this setting, if you still believe Kohberger did it, then obviously he was the hitman. Drug them, and Kohberger goes in to finish them off. But, to accomplish this even with them being drugged, someone inside had to be involved. Many believe that Mortenson and Funk were intoxicated, it was a quote, drug house, etc. None of this has been confirmed. What has been confirmed though, for what it's worth, is their accounts of what happened that night. And those accounts, specifically from Mortenson, in connection to my theory of the peers being drugged, tells me that Mortenson was quote, aware of her surroundings, so to speak. She was spared, because the individuals who were murdered were exactly who the killer came to handle. So, there was a target, but not from an outside stalker. This was from within the circle of that group, and maybe, Kohberger was hired to finish what had already been planned. I must say, we speak convincingly, and that may come off as claiming something to be a fact. Well, we only deal with logic, so if it hits home in that way, I'm sorry, we can't control what makes sense. There is a tangle that needs to be pulled apart. These theories are more logical than what has been plastered in the media. And that's all we want out of this case, logic to prevail. Because eventually, through logic, comes truth. This is the Chaos Sector.